Well, it's official. We are in a new era of the AFC North. What we have known as the status quo, especially since 2020, of relative stability amongst all four teams in the division at head coach is over, right? For the longest time, the Browns had the most stable division in all of football. Had Kevin Stefanski 5 seasons, Zach Taylor 6 seasons, 19 seasons for Mike Tomlin, 18 seasons for John Harbaugh. But today, only one man stands. Hilariously enough, it's who most people consider to be for the longest time the worst coach in the division. He is the guy who survives, not because people think he's good at his job, but simply because it would be inconvenient for the Bengals to fire him financially, which is a decision from Cincinnati. But that's the last man standing in the AFC North. That is the most tenured coach in the AFC North. Mike Tomlin is gone. He won't be coaching the Pittsburgh Steelers next year and likely won't be coaching anywhere else. We'll get into why I think that would be a bad idea for the Browns, just to get it out the way in just a second here. But he probably won't be coaching in the AFC North, nor will he be coaching anywhere else because he's still technically under control of Pittsburgh. You would have to trade for him. It's a Sean Payton situation with Mike Tomlin, from what I hear. If he wants another job in a year, you're going to have to give Pittsburgh some money and probably some draft assets, significant draft assets. We're probably talking about multiple first-round picks or something crazy like that. I think the Jets are probably going to trade for Mike Tomlin next year. That's my hot take. They got enough picks to do it. But anyways, that is the status quo change in the division. 2-time coach of the year, Kevin Stefanski, out. John Harbaugh, out. Mike Tomlin, out. All three of these guys, pillars of the AFC North. Guys, you close your eyes and you think of AFC North football, Ravens versus Steelers. That whole rivalry has existed in those guys' tenures. Gone. No longer there. It's fascinating to think about. But that is where the division stands. And I think what's even more fascinating is that all three of these coaches got fired justifiably with cause. Mike Tomlin lost 7 playoff games in a row. You just don't get to do that anywhere and keep your job. He was persuaded to be let go of, right, to move on. Then you have John Harbaugh, who, after disappointing season after disappointing season, doesn't even make the playoffs when they have championship or bust expectations. Well, he gets fired because of that. That makes sense. It's justifiable. Kevin Stefanski, after being touted as an offensive mind, 2 years where he's 32 in expected points, and not just 32, but 32 with a significant margin, and he's let go of. Justifiable. The only guy who doesn't have any kind of justifiability around him is Zach Taylor. There's no justifying keeping Zach Taylor out there in Cincinnati. They don't even attempt to justify keeping Zach Taylor there. They're just kind of shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, we don't want to pay for firing him. That's why they're not firing Zach Taylor. But that's the situation around the AFC North. Now, you want to know what I think about Mike Tomlin being the Browns coach? I have some thoughts about that. You want to know more about what I think about this firing? We'll get to that. But first, let me thank my sponsor, Sleeper. Hey, real quick, I want to tell you about a little bit of a sleeper of an app called Sleeper. Has fantasy, has news feed, has picks. You can do it all on the Sleeper app. Make sure you use it. Sign up using the promo code Worst Take and get to 100% match on up to $100 when you use promo code Worst Take. Again, 100% match for up to $100 when you use promo code Worst Take. You have a great day. Now let's continue the video. All right, so let's get this out the way, right? Because look, I have been a Browns fan my entire life, which means I have been listening to Cleveland Sports Talk Radio my entire life. And I know how often the fantasy scenario of John Harbaugh being available or Mike Tomlin being available for the Browns to hire for head coach, how prevalent that conversation has been for the last 18 years of Cleveland sports talk radio. There have been a lot of fantasy. Can the Browns trade for John Harbaugh if they fire him? Can the Browns trade for Mike Tomlin if they fire him? Conversations had over the last 18 years. So for a lot of people, they're probably like living what they feel like is a dream scenario with both these coaches being available. And I think that sometimes puts people in a situation where they idealize the names because they spent so much time chasing after those names, right? You know, I used the term in a video earlier this week, the great white buffalo, right? The big shark, the big whale, right? The great white whale or whatever it's called in Moby Dick, right? That is what those two names are. And just like in those stories where the chase for those names starts to become more about the character themselves and less about the actual function of catching the thing, that's kind of what the attraction to bringing in Mike Tomlin, to bringing in John Harbaugh is for a lot of Browns fans. But is that ideal a reality? I don't really think so. I've talked about this with John. I'm not as opposed to hiring John as I am to going after Mike Tomlin, especially because you would have to trade for Mike Tomlin to get him right. John's just available. You can hire him. And it doesn't seem like the Browns are going to be in the final call for who he's considering in that job. So, you know, it seems like the Browns are out of there. And I think that's ultimately good for the Browns because it opens them up to options that fit them a bit better than John Harbaugh. But the Mike Tomlin thing, right? Bringing in Mike Tomlin, I think it would be a long-term fantasy fulfillment for Browns fans to have Mike Tomlin on the team. But it's kind of like when you bring a player that you really liked 10 years ago onto the team 10 years after his prime. You're just fulfilling that wish, but you're not getting that player that you wanted 10 years ago. I think that's kind of what going after Mike Tomlin for Cleveland at this point would be. See, the Browns fired Kevin Stefanski because the Browns were pathetic on offense. So you would think when you hire somebody to replace Kevin Stefanski, one of the things you want them to have a track record of being able to do is fix an offense. If there is somebody who has more evidence of their inability to fix an offense than Mike Tomlin, that has been a head coach for a long time in the NFL, point me to them, but he would be the last person I would hire because you need to fix the offense. If you just wanted somebody who can stabilize the organization and give you some, like, again, the same reasons Mike Tomlin makes sense for a job like Las Vegas or the New York Jets job next year, which I think is ultimately where he's going to land. I think he will land with the Jets. I think Harbaugh will probably land. It doesn't seem like he's interested in the Raiders, so maybe New York. So maybe they both somehow end up in New York. But the reason those two make sense in those two spots, but not necessarily Cleveland, is simple. The Browns have invested a lot in their front office with Andrew Berry. That seems to be where they've invested the stability, and they still have 6 years of Andrew Berry of stability built there. So they're not really looking for somebody to stabilize the organization. They're just looking for a head coach. And when you're just looking for a head coach, you got to see what these guys bring to the table and if they're going to be able to bring those things to the table. If you need somebody to fix the offense, John Harbaugh's not a terrible choice, but he's not a guy who's going to have a solution on board with him. He has to hire a solution. If you hire Mike Tomlin to fix an offense, I think you're missing the point of why he had to leave Pittsburgh in the first place. I mean, His offensive work has been shoddy. The defensive work hasn't been very good either. You'll be switching over to a completely different philosophy on defense. It would just make no sense for Cleveland to go after Mike Tomlin. It might make sense for the Jets next year, right? When they have all those picks, they could trade for Mike Tomlin, and the organization like the Jets has no stability right now, especially if they fire Aaron Glenn. So Mike Tomlin gives you the credibility to create that stability while you try to build upon that team's foundation. The same thing with like John Harbaugh in New York, where you're just looking for stability there. John Harbaugh provides that stability. For a job like Cleveland, I don't think they provide what they need to provide. Will there be buy-in? Sure. Will that be a benefit? Sure. Will it be easier for guys to buy into him versus like a 30-year-old up-and-coming offensive coordinator? Sure. But I think the Browns have to think a little bit bigger when it comes to this coaching search and a little bit longer term here, right? The Browns have a young developing roster. They need to have somebody who can develop young players on offense. You don't need to hire somebody who's demonstrated that he struggles in those moments. So I think that even though we spent 18 years fantasy booking and fantasizing about the ideal of going after John Harbaugh and going after Mike Tomlin, and the opportunity's finally here to go and maybe get John Harbaugh or maybe get Mike Tomlin, we have to understand that Pittsburgh and Baltimore did not get rid of these guys for no reason. You have to consider that maybe they're not the same guys that you wanted 10 years ago. And you have to consider their recent body of work and ask yourself, does that body of work translate to fixing the problems that the Cleveland Browns are going to be tasked with fixing? I understand why Mike Tomlin would be attractive to the Cleveland market. Obviously, no market has spent more time pumping up Mike Tomlin's reputation than Cleveland outside of Pittsburgh. But for me, the Mike Tomlin thing feels like it's an obvious no. I mean, like, you would have to trade draft picks to get him. You would probably have to give up like 2 firsts to get him. If I'm giving up 2 firsts for anything, I'm getting a quarterback, not a coach. Just makes no sense for the Browns. But what does this mean for Pittsburgh is another question, right? Will this mean that Pittsburgh will finally fall through the cracks? Will this mean that Pittsburgh will finally stink? I don't know. Pittsburgh's in a very vulnerable place, if I'm being honest with you. They don't have a quarterback. The core players on their roster are very old. I don't know how long they're going to have an appetite to stay on the Steelers without Mike Tomlin. And those guys are very much Tomlin guys, right? So the new guy is going to have a tough time, especially if he's hired from the outside, which I would imagine that he is. If you are looking at that Pittsburgh job, on paper, it's not really that great of a job, right? No quarterback, old roster, expensive roster, not a lot of cash to spend in Pittsburgh. You're going to have to basically strip that thing down and do a full rebuild in Pittsburgh over the next 5 years. That's what Pittsburgh's going to have to do. They're going to have to strip it down and do a full rebuild. Welcome to Rebuild City, Pittsburgh fans. That's where you're at, right? You're going to have to just do it right. You're going to have to just strip it down, rebuild over the next 5 years. Now, the reason why the Pittsburgh job might be attractive is if you are a coach, you can convince yourself that Pittsburgh is very likely to give you that 5 years. Like, if they tell you they're going to give you 5 years to figure it out, you can believe that that's probably a thorough promise because they have not fired more than 10 they have 10 coaches in team history. So you feel pretty confident that they're not going to just fire you if things don't work out. So that's what that job's going to be, though. That is a full rebuild job. I think you fire Mike Tomlin because you're finally deciding, if you're Pittsburgh, we're going to just let go and rebuild. They probably should have did this right after the Big Ben retirement, but they have finally just decided that they're going to let go. They're going to rebuild. They might go under 500 for a couple of years, might have some lean years, but hopefully if you're Pittsburgh, they feel like they come out of it better. But that's going to be what Pittsburgh's going to have to do, right? They're going to have to let it go, and I'm going to be interested to see who they go after head coach wise, because Baltimore seems to only be interested in retreads, which suggests that they're trying to win now right away. Cleveland has been going for up and comers. Like, they have been looking at a lot of up and comers. Pittsburgh, I don't know where they'll end up. I could see them looking at retreads. I could see them looking at up and comers. We'll see where they're going to land going forward. But that's my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Everybody have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.